My son screamed in my face when I refused to hand over my pension. Either get out of my house today, or stay home watching the kid and hand over every cent you get. Your choice, old man. He said my house. Perhaps he forgot whose name was on the deed. Perhaps he forgot who paid for every wall he was standing between. What happened next made him go pale. Welcome to Wise Revenge, and thank you for being here. Before we go further, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. Your city, your state, your country. I want to know who's at this table with me. Every single comment means something. Now let's get into the story. And one quick note, this story contains fictional elements for entertainment and educational purposes. Names and settings are coincidental, but the lesson inside is worth every minute. I used to tell my junior analysts that every number tells a story. Not the story you think it does when you first look at the screen. Not the clean narrative the quarterly report wants you to believe, but the real one underneath the one written in the gap between what a company claims and what it actually does. 31 years on Wall Street taught me to read that gap. I never imagined I would one day have to read it in my own son. My name is Arthur Vance. I am 68 years old, and for the better part of 4 decades, I managed money for people who had more of it than sense. Pension funds, private equity, high net worth individuals who called me at 7 in the morning because the futures were moving and they needed a voice that would not panic. I was that voice. I built a reputation on 2 things, patience and precision. I never made a move I had not already lived through 3 times in my head. I retired from active management 6 years ago. My wife Carol had been gone for 2 years, by then taken by a cancer that moved faster than anything I had ever tracked on a chart. And the apartment on the Upper East Side we had shared for 20 years felt less like home and more like an exhibit. Everything in it was evidence of a life that no longer had its other half. So when my son Michael called me on a Tuesday evening and said, "Dad, we have a place out here in Bel Air, plenty of room. Leo would love having you around," I listened. I had spent 30 years reading between the lines of balance sheets and earnings calls, and what I heard between Michael's words that night sounded genuine. It sounded like a son who wanted his father close. I flew out to Los Angeles in August. The house sat on half an acre in the hills above Sunset Boulevard, the kind of property that makes people lower their voices when they describe it. A 5-bedroom Spanish colonial with a guest house I had purchased in 2003 and spent 2 years restoring. I had offered it to Michael and his wife Sarah as a place to raise Leo when the boy was born, with the understanding that it remained mine, that the deed, the title, every legal thread attached to that house ran back to one name. Mine. The first 8 months were quiet in the way that a sky is quiet before a pressure system moves in. Michael was cordial at breakfast. Sarah kept the kitchen immaculate and smiled at the right moments. Leo, who had turned 10 that past February, called me Grandpa when he remembered, and Old Man when he forgot, which was most of the time. I let it go. Boys learn what they are taught, and I was more interested in watching than correcting. I watched Michael take calls in the driveway so I would not hear them. I watched Sarah reorganize this kitchen in a way that moved every item I used to the highest shelves. Small things. The kind of thing that does not show up on any report, but accumulates the way debt accumulates quietly and then all at once. I kept a small blue notebook in my shirt pocket, a habit from my first year as an analyst when my supervisor told me that the most important information is always the kind nobody thinks you are writing down. I started filling pages again that September. Not because I was planning anything, because I recognized the pattern. On a Thursday morning in early October, I came downstairs to find Michael on the phone in the living room, his back to the hallway, his voice carrying the particular confidence of a man who believed he was alone. "Yeah, it is a great property," he said. Been in my family for years. My father stays here now, you know how it is, but the house is mine. I stopped in the doorway. The coffee in my hand was still too hot to drink. He did not hear me. He kept talking, describing the square footage, the guest suite, the view from the east terrace, using the word mine 4 more times in 2 minutes. I counted. I walked back to the kitchen, poured the coffee down the drain, and stood at the window, looking out at the garden I had designed and planted and paid for. Ray Kowalski from next door was out early, deadheading his roses with the focused expression of a man who had learned that some things only improve when you cut them back. He had been a real estate attorney for 30 years before he retired, and in the months since my arrival, he had become the kind of neighbor who appears at the fence with 2 cups of coffee at exactly the right moment. I went out through the side door. "You look like a man who just heard something he cannot unhear," Ray said, handing me the second cup. "Michael is telling people this house belongs to him." Ray was quiet for a moment. He clipped a dead bloom and dropped it into the bucket at his feet. "You going to say something to him?" I took a sip of the coffee. It was the good kind, the dark roast he ordered from a place in Vermont that shipped it overnight, because Ray believed certain things were worth the cost. "Not yet," I said. 3 mornings later, Michael sat down across from me at the breakfast table and told me exactly what he thought I was worth. He came to the table, the way men come to negotiations. They believe they have already won, jacket off. Sleeves rolled the particular looseness of someone who has rehearsed what he is about to say and decided it cannot go wrong. Michael sat down across from me and slid a piece of paper across the table like it was a term sheet. I looked at it without picking it up. A number. Handwritten, circled twice. Every dollar of my monthly pension down to the cent. He had looked it up. That told me more than the number itself. "The house costs money to run, Dad. Property taxes, utilities, maintenance. It adds up. It's only fair that everyone contributes." "Everyone," I said. "You've got the pension, the consulting residuals. You're comfortable." He wrapped both hands around his mug. "We're a family. Families share." 31 years of reading people across conference tables had taught me that the word family, when used in a financial conversation, almost always means I would like your money and would prefer you to feel good about giving it to me. "How much of this did Sarah suggest?" I asked. "This is my idea." "So we're agreed." I didn't say that. The color came into his jaw first, the way it always had since he was a boy. "Some patterns do not change. They only find larger rooms to play out in. I'm not asking you to go without. I'm asking you to contribute. To this household. To your grandson's home. Leo's home." I said, "Is wherever Leo is loved and looked after. That has nothing to do with a number on a piece of paper." He pushed back from the table, walked to the counter, poured more coffee he did not need. Then he turned around. "You think because you built something you own it forever. I run the company now. I run this household. You're retired, Dad. You're a guest here." The word landed the way he meant it to. I felt it in my chest, the specific pain of hearing your own child say something he cannot take back. I had changed that boy's diapers, driven him to hockey practice at 5:30 in the morning for 4 years. Co-signed his first business loan and never mentioned it again. I breathed through it. "Either get out of my house today or stay home watching the kid and hand over every cent you get. Your choice, old man." From the hallway came the soft creak of the 3rd step on the staircase. I did not look toward it. But I knew Leo was there, standing in his school socks, listening to his father talk to his grandfather, the way you talk to someone whose name you do not plan to remember. I reached across the table and picked up the piece of paper, folded it once and slid it into my breast pocket next to the blue notebook. "I heard you," I said. I went outside and sat on the bench beside the olive tree. Behind me, through the kitchen window, I heard Michael's voice lower now on the phone, telling someone the old man was being difficult. I opened the blue notebook to a fresh page and wrote word for word exactly what my son had just told me to do with my life. Then 3 more words underneath. Not yet, Michael. Ray did not come out with the coffee that morning. Instead, the side gate opened, and he leaned against the post with his arms crossed, and the expression of a man who had heard everything through a kitchen window and was deciding how much of it to acknowledge. "You want to talk about it?" he asked. "Not particularly." He nodded, went back inside. That was what I valued most about Ray Kowalski. He understood the difference between being needed and being wanted, and he never confused the two. I sat in the garden for the better part of an hour. The olive tree threw a long shadow across the flagstones. Somewhere in the neighborhood, a leaf blower started up, then stopped, then started again, the particular restless sound of a Saturday morning in Bel Air, where even the groundskeepers seemed uncertain about their purpose. I listened to it and thought about Carol, who had hated leaf blowers with a passion she usually reserved for dishonest people and undercooked chicken. I went back inside at 9:30. Sarah was in the kitchen, unloading the dishwasher with the focused efficiency she brought to every domestic task, each plate placed with a precision that looked like calm and felt, if you knew her, like the opposite. She was 38 years old and had the posture of a woman who had decided very early that the world responded better to surfaces than to depths. We had managed in 8 months of shared space to develop a cordial working relationship, built entirely on the agreement that neither of us would say what we actually thought. She looked up when I came in. "Arthur." Not a greeting exactly, a notation. "Sarah." She placed a bowl in the cabinet above the counter, the high one, and said without turning around, "Michael's upset." "I know. He feels like you're not being a team player." I took a glass from the drying rack and filled it at the tap. I wasn't aware we were on the same team. Her shoulders tightened by a fraction, which for Sarah was the equivalent of a flinch. She closed the cabinet and turned to face me, and in her eyes was the particular calculation of a woman running numbers she would rather not share out loud. "He works very hard," she said, "for this family." "So do I," I said. "I just do it differently." I took my water and went to my room. I spent the afternoon reading, or attempting to. The words kept arranging themselves into patterns I did not want to follow. At 4 o'clock, I heard voices downstairs, Michael's and Sarah's, the low, rapid exchange of two people coordinating rather than conversing. Then footsteps on the stairs. Then a knock at my door that was less of a question than a statement. Michael opened the door before I answered. He had changed into a collared shirt, which meant he had decided this was a formal occasion. Behind him in the hallway, I could see Leo standing very still against the wall, wearing the expression children wear when they know something bad is happening and have been told to stay out of it. "I want to give you one more chance," Michael said, "to be reasonable about this." I set my book down. "I've been nothing but reasonable, Michael. You're refusing to contribute to your own household. I'm refusing to hand over my pension to yours. Those are different things." His jaw went tight. He stepped into the room, and I saw then what 8 months of accumulating grievance looked like on my son's face up close, the compressed anger of a man who had convinced himself so thoroughly of his own version of events that any contradiction felt like an attack. "You know what?" he said, and his voice had the bright, brittle quality of something about to break. "I have done everything for you, everything. We opened our home, my home," I said quietly. "We made room, Michael. We rearranged our entire lives, Michael." I said it the way I had learned to say things on trading floors when the noise needed to stop. Flat, final, carrying no heat at all. He stopped. "Han, this house," I said, "stands on a deed with my name on it. It has since 2003. I paid for the foundation, the roof, the kitchen. You're standing in the driveway your cars sit on. I have never asked you for $1 of rent. I have never asked you for anything. But I will not hand you my pension because you've decided you're entitled to it." The color drained from his face and then flooded back in a rush. "So fine," he said. The word came out clipped and cold. He pulled his phone from his pocket. "Fine, then we'll settle this the right way." He dialed. I heard it ring twice before someone picked up. "Yeah, hi," Michael said, turning half away from me. "I need a unit at—" He gave the address, his voice smoothing into the reasonable register people use when they want to sound like the wronged party. "I have a situation with an elderly resident who is refusing to vacate the property." Elderly resident. I heard Leo make a sound in the hallway. A small sound, the kind a child makes when something crosses a line he did not know existed until it was crossed. I looked past Michael and found the boy's eyes wide and dark and fixed on his father's back with an expression I had not seen on Leo's face before. It was not confusion. It was the beginning of something much more important than confusion. Sarah appeared behind Leo, put both hands on his shoulders, steered him back toward his room. Over her shoulder, she looked at me once, and in that look was something she would never say in front of her husband. Not apology, not quite, but the specific discomfort of a person who knows the story they are part of is not the one they would have chosen. Michael finished the call, pocketed his phone. "They'll be here in 20 minutes, he said. I stood up from my chair, straightened my shirt, picked up the blue notebook from the nightstand, and slid it into my breast pocket. "Good," I said. "I'll put some coffee on." They arrived in 17 minutes, not 20. 2 officers in a black and white unit parking at the curb with the unhurried precision of people who have responded to calls like this before and already know before they reach the door what kind of situation they are walking into. I had the coffee ready. I also had the blue notebook open on the kitchen counter, pen beside it. The deed to the house sitting underneath the original, not a copy, the one with the county seal embossed in the lower left corner, that I had kept in a fireproof box in my closet since 2003. Michael answered the door. He had put on what I thought of as his boardroom voice, the measured, reasonable tone he used when he needed people to believe he was the calmest person in the room. "Thank you for coming," he said. "I appreciate it. We have a situation with my father. He's been staying here and he's refusing to cooperate with some very reasonable requests, and I think it's time we got this sorted out officially." The lead officer was a woman. She was around 40 with the kind of face that had learned not to react to things until it had finished gathering information. Her name tag read Reyes. She looked at Michael for exactly as long as it took to understand him, then looked past him at me, standing in the kitchen doorway with a coffee cup in my hand. "Sir," she said to me, "are you Arthur Vance?" "I am." "This is your residence?" "It is." She looked at Michael again. Something in her expression did not change, but something behind it did. "Can I ask who called this in?" she said. "I did," Michael said. "He's been refusing to vacate. I need him removed. Detective Reyes." I would learn her first name was Hannah. Though she never offered it, that evening had the steady, unhurried manner of someone who had long ago made peace with the fact that most calls turn out to be something other than what they were reported as. She asked Michael for his identification, which he produced. She asked if he had documentation establishing his ownership of the property. Michael's hand went to his jacket pocket and found nothing. "I'm his son," he said. "I live here. This is a family property." "Sir, I understand." "Do you have the deed?" A title document, anything showing your name on the property? The boardroom voice developed a crack in it. It's a family home. My father lives here. Surely that's... I can run the county records right now if that would help, Reyes said. She was already reaching for the tablet clipped to her belt. The LA County Assessor's Office maintained a public property database, every parcel in Los Angeles County, searchable by address ownership, updated in real time. It took her less than 40 seconds. She looked at the screen. Then she looked at me. "Mr. Vance," she said, and her voice had shifted slightly, acquired the particular careful neutrality of an officer who has just realized she is speaking to the owner of the property. She was called to, "The county records show this property is held solely under the name Arthur James Vance. There is no secondary owner listed, no joint tenancy, no right of survivorship attached to any other party." From behind her I heard Michael make a sound. Not a word. Just a sound, the compressed, airless noise a person makes when the floor disappears beneath them and they have not yet started falling. What that means. Reyes continued, addressing Michael now with the same careful neutrality, is that Mr. Vance is the sole legal owner of this property. You are currently residing here, which may make you a tenant or a licensee depending on the arrangement, but it does not give you the authority to request his removal. In fact, as the property owner, Mr. Vance would be the one with the right to ask you to leave, not the other way around. She let that sit for a moment. I'd strongly advise you not to interfere with Mr. Vance's use and enjoyment of his own home. That could expose you to civil liability. Michael's face had gone through several colors and settled on a grayish white. Sarah had appeared at the bottom of the stairs at some point during Reyes's explanation. She stood with one hand on the newel post, and the expression on her face was the expression of someone running calculations and not liking the results. Ray had come to stand just outside the open front door. He had not been invited. He was holding his own coffee cup and leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed. And if there was a small amount of satisfaction in his posture, he was doing a respectable job of concealing it. "Is there anything you need from me tonight, officer?" I asked. Reyes looked at me. A very brief pause. "No, sir. I think we're good here." She handed me a card. "If you have any further issues, don't hesitate to call." She looked once more at Michael, the look of someone filing information away for future reference, and then she and her partner walked back down the front path to the black and white. Michael stood in his own foyer, my foyer, and did not move for a long moment. His hands were at his sides. His jaw was working at something that had not yet become a word. Ray pushed off the doorframe. "Heck of an evening," he said pleasantly, and went back to his own house. I picked up the deed from the kitchen counter, returned it to the fireproof box, and carried my coffee upstairs. Outside Leo's door, I paused. There was no sound from inside. I raised my hand to knock, then decided against it. Some things needed a night to settle before they could be spoken. I went to my room, sat at the desk by the window, and opened the blue notebook to a fresh page. Below the date, below the time, I wrote 4 words. Round 1 to Arthur. Then I crossed them out. This was not a game. It had never been a game. It was something much older and much sadder than that, and I needed to remember the difference if I was going to do what came next without losing something I could not afford to lose. I left the page blank and went to bed. Outside, the Bel Air hills were quiet in the way that expensive places are always quiet. Not peaceful exactly, but well insulated from the sound of consequences. That was about to change. I did not sleep. Not because I was angry. Anger is a young man's fuel, and I had burned through my supply of it somewhere around the 3rd decade of watching markets move on, nothing more substantial than fear and pride. What kept me at the desk was something quieter and more deliberate. The particular focus that comes when a man who has spent his life reading risk finally turns that skill on his own situation and sees with complete clarity exactly what he is looking at. I opened my laptop at 11:47. I know the time because I wrote it in the blue notebook first, the way I had always logged the start of any significant transaction. I had 17 automatic payments running from my accounts. I knew this because I had set them all up myself years ago, with the same methodical attention I brought to portfolio construction. Electricity, water, gas, high-speed internet, the premium package Michael had insisted on for his video calls, landscaping service, pool maintenance, security system monitoring, streaming subscriptions, 4 of them, none of which I used, car insurance for 2 vehicles, both titled in my name, homeowner's insurance, property tax escrow, HOA fees for the Bel Air Association, a weekly grocery delivery service Sarah had enrolled in without mentioning it to me. I canceled them in the order I had set them up. It took 41 minutes. Each cancellation required a confirmation click, a small digital acknowledgement that yes, I understood what I was doing. Yes, I wanted to proceed. I clicked through every one of them with the same steady hand I had used to execute trades worth 8 figures on a volatile Thursday afternoon. There was no satisfaction in it, not exactly. There was something more like the sensation of a knot releasing a tension I had not realized I was carrying until it was no longer there. I closed the laptop at 12:28, wrote the time in the notebook, went to bed and slept 4 hours, which at 68 is often enough. I was on the back porch with my coffee at 6:15 when Leo came downstairs. He appeared in the kitchen doorway in his pajamas, hair sideways from sleep, and looked at me through the glass with an expression that was trying very hard to be the casual expression of a 10-year-old who had not spent the previous evening watching his father get corrected by a police officer in his own foyer. He pushed the door open. "You're up early," he said. "I'm always up early." He considered this, then came outside and sat on the step below me, elbows on his knees. For a while neither of us spoke, which was different from the silence of the previous evening that had been the silence of things unsaid. This was the silence of 2 people who were not yet sure what they wanted to say, but were comfortable enough to wait. "Grandpa," Leo said finally, without looking up, "does our house really belong to you?" I looked at the back of his head. The cowlick he had inherited from Michael, who had inherited it from me. "It does," I said. He absorbed this the way children absorb difficult facts, not with drama, but with a kind of careful internal reorganization, like a boy quietly moving furniture in a room nobody else can see. "Dad said it was ours," he said. "I know he did." Leo picked at a loose thread on the cuff of his pajama sleeve. "Is Dad in trouble?" Before I could answer, the lights went out inside the house. Not a flicker, not a surge, just the clean, absolute absence of power, the kitchen light, the range hood display, the little green standby dot on the cable box, all extinguishing at once as the billing cycle caught up with last night's cancellations. In the sudden quiet, I heard the hum of the refrigerator wind down to nothing. Leo turned around and stared at the dark kitchen. "What happened? The electricity," I said, "has been disconnected." "Why?" "Because the bill wasn't paid." He stared a moment longer, working through the logic of it, with the particular focused expression of a child who is smarter than the adults around him have accounted for. Then slowly, he looked at me. Not at the house. At me. I watched him understand something. I could not have said exactly what, but I saw the moment it arrived in his face. A shift in the eyes. A slight parting of the mouth. The expression of a boy revising a story he had been told so many times. He had stopped questioning it. From upstairs came the sound of Michael's voice, then Sarah's, then feet on the floor, then feet on the stairs. Michael appeared in the kitchen, in yesterday's shirt, hair uncombed, phone already in hand. He stabbed at the screen with his thumb, trying the internet connection that was no longer there, checking the power company app on cellular data that was still running on a plan I had not yet touched. He saw me through the glass. He came outside, and the morning air between us felt like the space between two weather systems. "You did this," he said. "I canceled my automatic payments," I said. "All 17 of them. I sent written notice to each provider last night. They processed it this morning." "You can't just—" He stopped, started again. "People live here, Dad. Leo lives here. You shut off the power to a house with a child in it. And I shut off the power to a house whose occupants told me I was a guest," I said. "Guests don't pay the utilities." His hands opened and closed at his sides, fingers spreading wide the way hands do when a person wants to grab something and cannot identify what. "This is insane. This is actually insane," Michael. I kept my voice level the way I had kept it in every difficult conversation of my professional life. "You told me last night in front of a police officer who confirmed you have no legal claim to this property that I could either leave or hand over my pension. I'm doing neither. What I'm doing is conducting myself accordingly." Sarah appeared in the doorway behind him. She had her phone pressed to her ear, speaking quietly to someone, the electric company, I assumed, or perhaps a friend, or perhaps a lawyer. Her eyes found mine over Michael's shoulder and held there for a moment, with an intensity that went beyond calculation into something rawer and less controlled. Leo was still sitting on the step below me. He had not moved through any of it. His pajama sleeve was twisted around his finger, now wound tight, and he was looking at the dead kitchen with the expression of someone watching a version of their life they had not been shown before. I put my hand briefly on the top of his head, the way I had done when he was small enough that he did not have opinions about it. "Come on," I said quietly. "I have a gas camp stove in the garage. We'll make eggs." He unwound his sleeve, stood up, followed me without a word. Behind us, Michael was on the phone, his voice climbing toward a register. I recognized the register of a man who is starting to understand that the problem he has is not the kind that a phone call fixes. He was right about that. The cars were next. The tow truck arrived at 6:52 the following morning. I know the time because I was already on the front porch with my coffee, and I checked my watch when I heard it turn onto the street, a white flatbed with the name of the recovery service stenciled on the door, moving at the particular unhurried speed of a vehicle whose driver has been paid in advance and has nowhere urgent to be. I had called the night before, after Leo was in bed, and Michael and Sarah had retreated to their room with the muffled, pressurized quality of two people conducting an argument they did not want overheard. The service was straightforward. Both vehicles were titled in my name. Both insurance policies had been canceled the previous evening, and I wanted them returned to a storage facility in Culver City, where I maintained a small account. The man I spoke to asked for the VINs, the title numbers, and a credit card. The whole conversation took 11 minutes. The flatbed operator was a heavy-set man in his late 50s with a gray beard and the economical movements of someone who has spent decades doing physical work efficiently. He checked his paperwork against my ID, confirmed the vehicle identification numbers on both cars, and began the process of loading the first SUV, a black one, Sarah's, with a child's soccer cleat still visible in the back window, onto the flatbed, with a competence that was almost soothing to watch. I was on my second cup of coffee when Ray appeared at the fence. He had the particular alertness of a man who had heard something interesting from his bedroom window and dressed faster than usual. He was still buttoning his flannel shirt with one hand, while the other rested on the fence post. "Morning," he said. "Morning, Ray." He looked at the flatbed at the black SUV now secured on the platform at the operator beginning the paperwork for the second vehicle, a silver one, Michael's, with a parking permit for a downtown garage hanging from the mirror. "Both of them," Ray said. "Both of them." He nodded slowly, the way a man nods when something confirms what he already suspected. "Title in your name." "Since the day I bought them." He was quiet for a moment. A mockingbird started up in the liquid umbar tree at the edge of the property, running through its catalog of borrowed songs with the cheerful, indiscriminate energy of something that has never worried about consequences. "You sleep?" Ray asked. 4 hours. It was enough. The side door opened, and Leo came out in his school uniform backpack on one shoulder and stopped on the top step. He looked at the flatbed. He looked at the empty space where the silver SUV had been parked every morning of the 8 months he had watched me drink coffee on this porch. He looked at me. I raised my cup slightly. "Good morning." He sat down on the step and put his backpack between his feet and watched the operator finish securing the second vehicle with the focused expression of a child who has decided that understanding what is happening is more important than reacting to it. The side door opened again, and Sarah came out dressed for work, car keys in her hand, out of pure muscle memory. The automatic gesture of a woman who had retrieved those keys from that hook on that wall every weekday morning for 8 months. She was 3 steps down the path before she registered the absence. Her hand with the keys in it stopped moving. She stood very still and looked at the flatbed. "Arthur." Her voice had a quality I had not heard from her before. Not the careful social surface, not the calculation, something underneath, both of those raw and unmanaged. "Arthur, those are our cars." "They were my cars," I said. "I've had them returned to storage. I have a meeting at 8:30. The words came out flat, stripped of everything but their immediate logistical content. The way words come out when a person is processing something too large to process and has found a small, specific thing to hold on to instead. "There's a bus stop on Sunset," I said. "The 702 goes downtown. Ray can tell you the schedule. He used it for a year when his car was in the shop." Ray, to his credit, kept his face completely neutral. He had the disciplined expression of a man who understood that certain moments require witness, not commentary. Sarah looked at me for a long moment. Her jaw was tight, her eyes bright with something that had not yet decided what it was going to be. Then she turned and went back inside, and I heard the particular sound of someone moving through a house with more force than the situation technically required. Michael came out 4 minutes later. He had his own keys in his hand, had clearly not heard or not processed the conversation from wherever he had been, and he made it all the way to the end of the path before he stopped. He stared at the empty driveway. Both spaces bare concrete in the early morning light, the oil stains and tire marks of 8 months of daily use suddenly visible in a way they had never been when the cars were there to cover them. The flatbed was already at the end of the street, turning right onto Sunset. Michael turned around. His face was doing something complicated, running through several expressions at once, in a way that landed on none of them. His eyes found mine across the 20 feet of front path between us. "Dad." The word came out different from every other time he had used it in the past 8 months. Quieter, more uncertain, as if he had just picked it up and found it heavier than he remembered. "You can call a rideshare," I said, "or the bus, whichever you prefer." A car slowed on the street in front of us. A neighbor, an older woman in a white Lexus who lived 4 houses down and had waved to me every morning since I arrived. Slowing now to navigate around a recycling bin someone had left too far into the road, and in the process, catching a clear view of the Vance driveway and its notable absences. I saw her eyes move from the empty spaces to Michael standing at the end of the path, to me on the porch, and I saw the information register the way information registers in small communities, where everyone knows the outline of everyone else's arrangements. She drove on without waving. Michael called the rideshare. I heard him on the phone from the porch, his voice doing its best to reassemble itself into something functional, giving the address with the careful enunciation of someone who is concentrating on small things to avoid looking at large ones. Leo had not moved from the step. When Michael passed him on the way back inside to wait for the car, he did not look at his son. Leo watched him go. Then he looked at me, and in his 10-year-old face was an expression I recognized from a long time ago, from the faces of analysts in their first real downturn, the specific look of someone who has just understood that the map they were given does not match the territory they are standing in. "Grandpa," he said carefully, "are you and Dad going to be okay?" I looked at him for a moment, at the cowlick, at the backpack between his feet. "I don't know yet," I said, "but I'm going to be." Ray made a small sound against the fence post that might have been a cough. The mockingbird kept singing. Before I reveal what Arthur did next, 11 words that dismantled everything Michael had built, type the number 7 in the comments, so I know you're still with me. Every single number I see reminds me why I keep telling these stories. Thank you for being here. And a quick note, this story contains fictional elements crafted for educational and entertainment purposes. If that is not for you, no hard feelings, step away anytime. But if you're staying, things are about to get very interesting. The email took me 11 minutes to write. Not because I was uncertain about the words, I had known what I needed to say, since the morning Michael sat across from me at the breakfast table with that circled number on a piece of paper. What took the time was the discipline of saying it correctly. In 31 years of financial markets, I had learned that the most consequential communications are always the shortest ones. A long email is a negotiation. A short one is a fact. I wrote it at my desk the following morning before 6, while the house was still in the particular suspended quiet of people sleeping off the previous day's events. The subject line was 4 words, a note from Arthur. The body was 3 sentences. Effective immediately, I am withdrawing from all advisory and consultative roles associated with Vance Capital Management. Any decisions, representations, or commitments made by Michael Vance do not carry my endorsement or the weight of my professional relationships. I wish the firm well. I addressed it to 14 people. Fund managers, institutional partners, 2 family offices on the East Coast, a pension administrator in Sacramento I had known for 22 years, and 3 individuals whose names would be recognized by anyone who followed West Coast private equity. People who had taken Michael's calls because those calls came with my name attached, whether Michael had understood that or not. I read it twice, changed nothing. Clicked send at 6:04 in the morning and closed the laptop and went to make coffee. By 8:15, my phone had received 6 replies. I did not read them at the kitchen table. I took them to the garden, to the bench by the olive tree, and read them in the order they arrived. The tone across all 6 was some variation of the same thing, concern, loyalty, and a very carefully worded version of the question everyone was actually asking, which was what happened, and what does it mean for our money? I replied to each one personally. Brief, warm, honest, within the limits of what was mine to say. I told them that my withdrawal was not a reflection on the firm's technical operations, that I wished Michael well, and that my decision was final. What I did not tell them, because it was not yet time, was what I had begun to suspect about where certain client funds were going. That would come later through proper channels with documentation, not through email, not yet. By 10 o'clock, 3 of the 14 had sent formal notices of intent to withdraw their capital commitments. I know because Michael called me at 10:12. I was still in the garden. The phone rang 4 times before I picked it up, not because I was avoiding him, but because I was watching a red-tailed hawk work the thermal above the ridgeline, and I wanted to finish watching it. What did you do? Not a question. The flat declarative of a man who already knows the answer and is buying time while he processes it. I sent a professional courtesy notice to my contacts, I said, letting them know I've stepped back. 3 funds called us this morning. 3 dad, to withdraw. I'm aware that might happen. You did this on purpose. His voice cracked on the last word, a fracture in the surface that revealed how close to the edge he was operating. You're destroying my company. I'm withdrawing my name from your company, I said. Whatever your company is without my name is what it always actually was. The silence on the line had a specific texture. The silence of a man standing in an office watching a number move in the wrong direction and understanding for the first time that he cannot stop it. I built that firm, Michael said, and his voice had dropped into something quieter and more dangerous than anger. I built it. You ran it, I said. There's a difference. I built the relationships that made it possible to run. You inherited them the way you inherited the house without understanding what they cost or what they required to maintain. Another silence. Longer. Fix this, he said. I won't. Dad, Michael. I kept my voice even the way I had kept it through every difficult conversation of my professional life. Through market crashes and client panics and the particular human wreckage of other people's bad decisions. What you said to me in this house, in my house, in front of my grandson, is not something I can unknow. You told me I was a guest. You told me to hand over my pension or get out. A man who says that to his father has forfeited something. I don't know yet if it can be recovered, but it cannot be papered over with a phone call. He hung up. I sat for a moment with the dead phone in my hand and looked at the hawk which had found what it was looking for and was dropping now toward the canyon below the ridge in a long, controlled descent that was almost beautiful to watch. Then my phone buzzed. A text, not a call. A number I had not seen in 3 years, a 650 area code Silicon Valley, and 2 lines of text from a man named Daniel Marsh, who had worked beside me for 6 years on the 34th floor of a building on Broad Street in Manhattan before he went west to run money of his own. Arthur. I heard. I'm sorry. Let me know if you need anything. I looked at it for a long time. Daniel had been 26 when I hired him, a kid from Cincinnati with a finance degree and the rare quality of knowing when to speak and when to watch. I had taught him everything I knew about reading a room, which in our business meant reading a balance sheet, which meant reading the gap between what people claimed and what they actually did. He had learned faster than anyone I had ever trained, and when he left to start his own fund, I had written his reference letter myself and meant every word of it. I typed back 3 words. Not yet, Daniel. I put the phone in my pocket and went inside to find Leo, who had come home from school and was sitting at the kitchen counter doing homework by the light from the window because the overhead fixture was still dead, and neither Michael nor Sarah had thought to call an electrician. I went to the garage and found the portable work lamp I kept for power outages, plugged it in on the extension cord, set it on the counter beside him. He looked up at me. Thanks, Grandpa, he said, and went back to his math. I stood there for a moment longer than necessary, watching my grandson do his homework, in the light I had provided in the house I owned, in the life I had built, and was still at 68, the only one responsible for protecting. Then I went upstairs and opened the blue notebook to a fresh page. At the top, I wrote 2 words. Not yet. I had walked the same route every afternoon since moving to Bel Air. Left out the side gate down the hill on Bel Air Road, right on Stone Canyon, past the reservoir where the water sat flat and silver in the late light. Then back up through the neighborhood on the upper road that curved past the larger estates before returning to the block. 45 minutes, the same pace, the same turns. Carol had always said I approached exercise the way I approached everything, as a system to be optimized and then left alone. She had not meant it as a compliment. I had been walking that route for 8 months, and in that time I had learned the neighborhood the way you learn any market you study long enough. Not just the visible surface of it, but the rhythms underneath. Which houses had regular visitors? Which driveways emptied at predictable times? Which residents waved and which ones looked away? A neighborhood like Bel Air has the particular quality of extreme privacy performed very publicly, and once you understand that the information it gives you is considerable. I first noticed it on a Tuesday in late October, 3 days after the email and the hawk and the portable work lamp. I was coming back up the upper road about 40 yards from the entrance to the property owned by Marcus Webb, a man I knew by sight and occasional wave, a widower in his mid-40s, who had made his money in commercial real estate and kept to himself in the way that recently solitary people sometimes do, filling their space with the particular careful orderliness of someone who has lost the person who used to share it. Sarah was coming out of his gate, not rushing, not looking over her shoulder, walking with the unhurried ease of someone leaving a place she had a right to leave. She was in the clothes she had worn to her meeting that morning, the gray blazer, the dark slacks, but her hair was different from how it had been at breakfast. Less structured, the way hair looks at the end of a day that has involved more than meetings. Marcus Webb was in the doorway behind her. He said something. She turned and smiled at him, the kind of smile I had not seen on Sarah's face in 8 months of shared meals and cordial exchanges, something warmer and less calculated than her usual register. He touched the door frame. She turned away and walked toward her car, which was parked 2 houses down, not in front of his house, I noticed. 2 houses down, I kept walking at exactly the same pace. She did not see me. I was on the upper side of the road, partially screened by the liquid ambar that overhung the sidewalk at that point, and she was looking at her phone as she reached her car. I watched her get in, watched the car pull out, watched it go down the hill toward our street. I walked the rest of the route and went directly to Ray's front door. He answered in his garden clothes, trowel in hand, with the expression of a man interrupted in the middle of something he was enjoying. He read my face and stepped back to let me in without asking what had happened. We sat at his kitchen table. He made coffee, the dark Vermont roast, and set a cup in front of me and sat down across from me and waited. I told him what I had seen, plainly in the order it had happened without editorializing. When I finished, Ray turned his cup around in his hands twice and looked at the table. "How many times?" he said. "First time I've seen it directly. But she parks 2 houses down. That's not an accident." Ray nodded. "No," he said. "That's not an accident. I need to understand what this means legally, not for Michael." I looked at him. "For Leo." Ray set his cup down. He had the expression he got when a question moved from the conversational into the professional. A slight settling of the face, a gathering of attention. 30 years of real estate law had given him a particular precision about what words meant and what they could be made to mean. "California is no fault," he said. "Adultery doesn't move the needle on asset division. Doesn't affect spousal support either way. That's not your leverage." "I'm not looking for leverage," I said. "I'm looking for Leo." He was quiet for a moment. "Grandparent visitation. Family Code 3100. He said it slowly, the way lawyers say things they want you to remember. "If Michael and Sarah's marriage dissolves, and there's reason to believe limiting your contact with Leo would be detrimental to him, a California court can order visitation rights for a grandparent. It's not automatic. You'd need to establish the relationship. I've been establishing it for 8 months. Then keep establishing it. He paused. But Arthur, if this goes anywhere, you're going to need documentation. Not accusations, dates, times, what you observed, what was observable. I reached into my shirt pocket and took out the blue notebook. Ray looked at it. A small smile crossed his face and disappeared. Of course you have that. I've had it since October, I said. I write down everything. Write down tonight, too. Date, time, what you saw, what she was wearing, where the car was parked. Keep it factual, no interpretation. I opened the notebook to a fresh page and wrote the date at the top. Below it, Tuesday afternoon. Sarah, Marcus Webb's property, the specific details in the specific order they had occurred. Car parked 2 houses north. Hair different from morning. Webb in doorway. Duration of observation, approximately 90 seconds. Ray watched me write. When I closed the notebook, he said, "How long do you think this has been going on?" Long enough that she has a system for it. He absorbed that. Outside, the sun was dropping behind the ridge, throwing the canyon into the soft gray gold that passed for dusk in Los Angeles in late October. The light that Carol had loved, and that I had learned to love, because she did. "What are you going to do with it?" Ray asked. "Nothing yet," I said. "I'm going to watch. I'm going to wait. And when the time is right, when it benefits Leo and not just the argument, I'm going to use it." Ray looked at me for a long moment with the expression of a man reassessing something. "You know," he said, "most people in your situation would have blown this up the same afternoon. Most people in my situation haven't spent 30 years watching what happens when you move too fast on incomplete information," I said. "The market always gives you more data if you're willing to wait for it." Ray picked up his cup. "You're a strange man, Arthur." "I'm a patient one," I said. "There's a difference." I walked home as the last of the light left the ridge. In the kitchen through the window, I could see Michael at the counter, phone in hand, doing the thing he always did when the world was not behaving as expected, calling someone who was not there to tell him what to do. I went in through the side door. Sarah was already upstairs. I could hear her moving in the room above the kitchen, the ordinary sounds of an ordinary evening. And I thought about systems, about the ones people build to manage the gap between what they are doing and what they want others to believe they are doing. And I thought about how long those systems hold and what happens when they don't. I took the blue notebook upstairs and added one more line at the bottom of the page. Second time. I will know when it is the right time. It was the printer that told me. Not Michael, not Sarah, not any conversation I overheard or any document I went looking for. The printer in the shared home office on the second floor, a machine I had purchased and installed and paid the ink subscription, for which meant that when it ran a job at 11:30 on a Wednesday night, the confirmation receipt came to my email along with the scanned output file. I almost deleted it without opening it. It was late, I had been reading, and print confirmations were the kind of administrative noise I had trained myself to filter. But something made me open it, perhaps the time 11:30 being an unusual hour for office work, even by Michael's standards. Or perhaps the particular sixth sense that 30 years of looking at numbers had given me for the moment when something that should be ordinary is not. The file was 4 pages. A financial summary, the kind generated by portfolio management software covering activity in what appeared to be a client account. I recognized the account format. It was the same system Vance Capital Management had used since I ran the firm, a platform I had selected myself in 2009 for its audit trail clarity. The numbers were wrong, not wrong in the way that an error is wrong, a transposed digit, a miscalculation. The ordinary mistakes of tired people working with large figures. Wrong in the specific, deliberate way that numbers are wrong when someone has decided that the rules governing them do not apply to their particular situation. Client funds designated as conservative fixed income allocations had been moved into a series of high volatility positions. Leveraged ETFs, speculative options, the kind of instruments that have no business being in an account, whose mandate was capital preservation. I had seen this pattern before, not often, but enough times to know what it meant and where it led. I got out of bed, made coffee, and sat at my desk with the 4 pages and the blue notebook, and worked through it the way I had worked through every difficult analysis of my career, methodically, without rushing to conclusions, following each number to its source, and then following the source to its logic, and then asking the question that matters most, which is not what happened, but why. By 2 in the morning, I had my answer. Michael's firm was hemorrhaging. The institutional withdrawals triggered by my email had accelerated what had already been a deteriorating situation. 2 quarters of underperformance, 2 key analysts who had left in the spring, a cost structure built for a higher revenue base than the firm currently had. He was underwater, and he had done what cornered people with access to other people's money sometimes do. He had reached for funds that were not his to reach for, and he had used them to make bets that he needed to win and was losing. It was a violation of FINRA Rule 2150, the prohibition on improper use of customer funds and securities. The rule exists because the history of financial services is full of people who told themselves that what they were doing was temporary, a bridge to a better outcome, something they would fix before anyone noticed. They were almost always wrong about the fixing part. I kept copies of the firm's compliance records from my time as advisory director. Not because I had anticipated this, I had not, but because I keep everything the same way I have kept every notebook, every receipt, every confirmation email since my first year as an analyst. The records were in a fireproof box, the same box that held the house deed, and they covered the period during which I had been responsible for oversight. They also provided context that would make the current activity legible to anyone who knew how to read it. At 2:40, I called Daniel Marsh. He was in San Francisco 3 hours behind nothing, because Daniel, like me, had never entirely learned to sleep past 3. He answered on the second ring. "I figured you'd call eventually," he said. No greeting. That was Daniel. He had always treated phone calls as conversations already in progress. "So I need you to listen to something," I said. "And I need you to tell me if I'm reading it correctly." I walked him through the 4 pages. He did not interrupt. Daniel Marsh was one of the 3 people in my professional life who could hear a set of financial figures read aloud and follow them without visual reference, a skill that sounds minor until you need it at 2:40 in the morning. When I finished, the line was quiet for a moment. "That's a 2150 violation," he said. "Clear one if those figures are accurate." They came from the firm's own system. Then they're accurate. Another pause. "Arthur, you know what this means." "I know what this means." FINRA has a whistleblower program. If you submit documentation through proper channels, they can open a formal inquiry. With the compliance records you have, the timeline would be, he paused, calculating 60 to 90 days for a preliminary determination. Maybe less if the violation is as straightforward as this looks. "I know the process," I said. "I want you to be the point of contact. Your standing with the regulatory community is current. Mine is retired." A brief silence on the line. "You're sure about this?" It was not a question about the violation. Daniel knew I was sure about the violation. It was a question about Michael, about what it means to hand your son's professional life to a regulatory body and ask them to examine it under bright light. "I'm sure," I said. "All right." His voice settled into the register it took on when a decision had been made, and the next thing was execution. "Send me the compliance files. I'll handle the submission. You won't need to be named as the primary complainant. The documentation can speak for itself. Send me the secure upload link in the morning." I said. "I'll have everything to you by noon." "Arthur." A pause. "I'm sorry it came to this." "So am I said. I meant it. There was nothing satisfying about what I had just set in motion. A regulatory inquiry is not a punishment. It is a process, slow and procedural and indifferent to the human circumstances that produced whatever it is examining. It would not care that Michael was my son. It would not care that I had driven him to hockey practice at 5:30 in the morning for 4 years, or co-signed his first loan or written checks whose amounts I had never mentioned, because I understood that a man needs to believe in his own capability to function. It would only care about the numbers. I closed the notebook and turned off the desk lamp and sat for a moment in the dark. Down the hall, Leo was asleep in his room, and whatever was coming would reach him eventually in the way that all adult failures reach children, eventually sideways in pieces, through the gaps in explanations that were never quite complete. I thought about that for a while. Then I went to bed, and this time I slept. The months between November and May have a particular quality when you are living inside a deteriorating situation and have decided for reasons of strategy and love and the complicated arithmetic of family not to accelerate it. You watch, you document. You maintain the surface of ordinary life breakfast. The garden, the afternoon walk, the blue notebook filling page by page. And underneath that surface, you do the work that needs doing quietly. The way water does its work on stone, not through force, but through persistence and time. I sent the compliance files to Daniel Marsh on a Thursday morning in November and did not think about them again in the way that you do not think about a letter once you have dropped it in the mailbox. It was in the system. The system would move at its own pace. My job was to be here in this house doing what I had always done, watching, waiting, and not moving until the moment was right. Winter came to Bel Air with the particular mildness that passes for winter in Los Angeles nights in the 50s mornings, that smelled of jasmine and eucalyptus. The hills going green for 3 months before the long dry season burned them gold again. Michael went to the office and came back later and later. Sarah continued her Tuesday afternoons. I continued my Tuesday walks and my Tuesday notes. Leo turned 11 in February, and I gave him a chess set, the good kind weighted pieces on a roll-up board, and we played on the kitchen counter on Saturday mornings while his parents slept. He was better than I expected. He thought 3 moves ahead, which is more than most adults manage, and he had the patience to wait for the position he wanted, rather than forcing the game. I did not tell him that those qualities would serve him better than almost anything else he would learn in school. Some things are better absorbed than taught. By April, the situation in the house had taken on the pressurized stillness of a weather system that has stopped moving. Michael came home one evening with the look I had seen on the faces of traders in the last hours before a margin call, the specific hollow quality of a man who has run out of moves and has not yet admitted it to himself. He said nothing at dinner. Sarah said nothing at dinner. Leo ate his food and looked at his plate and said with the careful social intelligence of a child who has learned to read adult silence the way other children read picture books, that the chicken was really good tonight, Grandpa. It was a Tuesday morning in May when I put the contract on the table. I had asked Ray to review it the previous week. Sitting at his kitchen table with the Vermont roast and the particular focused attention he brought to documents that mattered. He had gone through it twice, made 2 minor adjustments to the language in the termination clause, and handed it back with the annotation that it was clean enforceable. And he had paused here, probably the most civil thing Arthur could do under the circumstances. I printed it that morning, set it on the kitchen table beside Michael's coffee cup before he came downstairs. He appeared at 7:15 in yesterday's shirt, the shirt of a man who had stopped caring about the impression he made at home because the impression he was trying to maintain was elsewhere. He looked at the papers without touching them. "What is this?" he said. Not a question. The flat register of a man who has been dreading a specific thing and has just identified it. "A rental agreement," I said. "Month-to-month tenancy. $3,500 per month, utilities billed separately at cost. First month due on the 1st of June. He picked it up. Read the first page with the expression of someone hoping to find an error that would make the whole thing invalid. "You're charging me rent," he said. "In my father's house." "In my house?" I said. "Yes." He set it down, picked up his coffee. The muscle in his jaw worked steadily the way it always had when he was managing something he did not want to show. "Sarah," he called without turning around. She came in from the hallway in her work clothes, already dressed, already assembled. She looked at the papers on the table, and then at me with the expression of someone who has been running contingency calculations for months and has just been handed the scenario she ranked most likely. Michael slid the contract across the table toward her. She read it faster than he had. Her eyes moved down the page with the speed of a woman who has retained information and is now checking it against a mental model she has been building for some time. $3,500, she said. "Comparable to market rate for the area," I said. Ray confirmed the figure. Something moved across her face at the mention of Ray. Not surprise? Something more like the acknowledgement of a variable she had factored in, but had hoped would remain theoretical. "And if we don't sign," Michael said. I looked at him. "Then we have a different conversation." He knew what the different conversation was. I could see it in the way his shoulders settled, not relaxed, but resigned, the posture of a man absorbing a reality he cannot change. The Bel Air address was the last asset of reputational value he had. With the institutional withdrawals and the firm's deteriorating position, walking into a meeting and handing over a card with a Bel Air address was the difference between a conversation and a door closing before he sat down. He needed the address. We both knew it. He picked up the pen I had left beside the contract. Sarah put her hand on his arm. A brief pressure, the specific touch of two people communicating in the shorthand of a long marriage. He looked at her. She gave a small nod that had the quality of a concession rather than an agreement. He signed. I folded my copy, put it in the breast pocket of my shirt beside the blue notebook, and stood up. "Yeah, I'll have Ray draw up the utility billing schedule," I said. "You'll receive the first invoice end of month." I went to the garden. The olive tree had put out new growth, overnight small silver-green leaves at the tips of the old branches, the particular optimism of a plant that does not know or care about the difficulty of the season it is growing in. I sat on the bench and called Ray. "He signed," I said. Ray was quiet for a moment. How'd he look? Like a man who just paid rent to his father for the first time in his life. "How'd you look?" I thought about that. "Like a man who did not want it to come to this," I said, but knew it would. Ray made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "I'll draw up the utility schedule this afternoon. And Arthur, I'll have the unlawful detainer paperwork ready in the same folder, just in case." "I know," I said. "I'm counting on it." The new leaves on the olive tree moved in the morning air, silver and green, and quietly indifferent to everything that had just happened inside. I opened the blue notebook. Signed, I wrote, May 1st. He paid with the pen I provided. Then I closed it and sat in the garden for a while, listening to the mockingbird run through its catalog of other bird songs, and thought about the difference between winning and being right, and how rarely those two things arrive at the same time. The call came on a Thursday morning in June. I know this because I was in the garden at 7:15, coffee in hand, watching a pair of scrub jays work over the bird feeder I had hung from the olive tree in February, when I heard Sarah's voice through the kitchen window, careful modulated the voice she used for performances rather than conversations. "Yes," she was saying. "He's been confused, forgetting things. Last week he left the stove on twice. We're very worried about him. He's 68, and sometimes he doesn't seem to know where he is." I stood very still beside the olive tree, the stove. I had not left the stove on. I cooked precisely the way I did everything, and I had never in my life left a burner running unattended, because Carol had drilled that particular habit out of me in the first year of our marriage by telling me once and completely seriously that she had not survived 30 years of New York winters to burn down in a California kitchen. I went inside. Sarah was at the counter with her back to me, phone pressed to her ear, finishing the call with the careful warmth of someone who wants to be remembered as concerned. She turned and saw me, and something moved across her face, not guilt, not exactly, something more like the recalibration of a person who has committed to a course of action and is now required to see it through. "Arthur," she said. "Good morning." "Good morning, Sarah," I said. I put my coffee cup in the sink, went upstairs, and got the blue notebook. They arrived 40 minutes later. Detective Reyes and her partner, whom I recognized from October, and a third person I had not seen before. A woman in her late 30s with a canvas bag over her shoulder, and the particular careful manner of someone who has been asked to assess something that requires professional neutrality. The psychiatric evaluator. I had expected her. Detective Reyes looked at me when I opened the door with an expression that combined professionalism with something I read as reluctant familiarity. "Mr. Vance," she said, "we received a call expressing concern about your well-being." "I know," I said. "Please come in. I'll make tea." I made tea. Earl Grey loose leaf, the good kind that I ordered from a shop in Portland, because Carol had believed that the quality of tea was a reasonable indicator of a person's relationship with patience. I set 4 cups on the kitchen table for Reyes, her partner, the evaluator, and myself, and sat down. The evaluator introduced herself and explained the process in the careful language of someone accustomed to situations where the person being evaluated might be upset or disoriented. I listened politely. When she finished, I took the blue notebook from my breast pocket and set it on the table. "Before we begin," I said, "would you like me to tell you today's date, the current prime rate, the closing value of the S&P 500 yesterday, and the current 30-year fixed mortgage rate, or would you prefer to start with the standard orientation questions?" The evaluator looked at me for a moment. "Let's start with the standard questions," she said. She asked me what year it was, what month, who the current president was, whether I knew where I was. I answered each question in the order it was asked, clearly and without elaboration, the way I had answered questions in congressional testimony twice in my career when regulatory committees had wanted to understand what I knew about things other people had done. Then she asked me to describe my daily routine. I described it: the 6:15 wake-up, the coffee, the garden, the afternoon walk on Stone Canyon past the reservoir, the Saturday chess games with Leo, the notebooks, the reading. I described it with the specificity of a man who lives deliberately, which is what I am, and I watched her face as I spoke, and saw the moment when the professional neutrality shifted slightly into something that was not quite surprise but was adjacent to it. "Mr. Vance," she said, "can you tell me about your financial background?" I opened the blue notebook to the most recent page of market notations figures I recorded every morning as a habit from my working years, the same way a pianist runs scales, not because they are preparing for a performance, but because the fingers need to remember what they know. I read from the page: Current yield on the 10-year Treasury. The VIX. The dollar-yen exchange rate. The closing price of 3 specific equities I had followed for 30 years. I read them in the flat, precise cadence of a man for whom these figures are as ordinary as the weather because they are. When I finished, the evaluator looked at Detective Reyes. Reyes looked at Sarah, who was standing in the doorway of the kitchen with her arms crossed, and the expression of someone watching a plan arrive at a destination other than the one intended. "Mrs. Vance," Reyes said, and her voice had taken on the specific, careful quality it had carried in October when she was explaining to Michael that he had no legal standing in his father's house. "I'm going to need to speak with you separately." The evaluation concluded 22 minutes after it began. The evaluator produced a brief written summary on her agency letterhead. Arthur James Vance, 68 years of age, demonstrates full cognitive orientation, intact memory function, coherent and organized thought process. No indicators of impairment requiring intervention. She signed it, dated it, and handed me a copy because I asked for one. Sarah received a different document. Detective Reyes presented it at the kitchen counter with the same unhurried professionalism she had shown in October, which I was coming to recognize as her default register. She was simply a person who did not allow situations to make her loud. "California Penal Code 148.5, she explained, covered the filing of a false police report. The document Sarah was receiving was a formal caution, not yet a charge, but a documented warning that would remain on file and could be referenced in any subsequent proceeding. Sarah took the paper. Her hand was steady. I had to give her that. Leo was on the stairs. I did not look at him directly. I had learned that children in difficult moments are better served by not being seen to notice them, which allows them to watch without feeling watched. But in my peripheral vision, I could see him on the third step, the one that creaked, sitting with his arms around his knees, watching his mother receive a formal caution from a police officer at the kitchen counter of his grandfather's house. His face was doing something I had seen only once before the night in October, when Michael had called the police to remove me. The same expression, the same quiet interior work of a child revising a story he had been told so many times, he had stopped questioning it. I walked Detective Reyes and her team to the door. "Mr. Vance," Reyes said quietly on the threshold, "I hope we won't need to come back." "So do I said. "But if you do, I'll have the tea ready." The ghost of something crossed her face. Not a smile, not quite, but the thing that comes just before one in a person who has decided the situation does not warrant it. I closed the door, went to my room, picked up my phone, dialed. Daniel answered on the second ring. "It's time," I said. "Pull the files, before I tell you what Arthur placed on that dinner table tonight, and what it cost everyone sitting around it. Type WISE in the comments right now. Just that one word. Let me know you've stayed this far, because what happens next is what this whole story has been building toward. One note: this story includes fictional elements shaped for educational purposes. Certain details have been crafted for storytelling. If you'd prefer to stop here, that is completely your choice. I invited Ray to dinner on a Wednesday evening and told him why before he said yes. "I need a witness," I said. "Nothing more. Sit at the table, drink your water, and if anyone asks, you're there because I invited you." Ray looked at me over this fence with the expression of a man running a brief internal calculation. "What kind of witness?" "The kind who has already seen the notebook." He came at 6:30 in a collared shirt, which was the most formal I had ever seen him, and sat at the end of the table with a glass of water and the contained alertness of a retired attorney who understood exactly what his presence meant, without needing it explained twice. Michael did not ask why Ray was there. He sat down, looked at Ray, looked at me and picked up his fork with the mechanical motion of a man who has stopped expecting evenings in this house to be ordinary. Sarah sat across from me. She had changed after work, which she rarely did for dinner anymore, and the care she had taken with her appearance had the specific quality of armor rather than vanity. We ate for 10 minutes without the conversation becoming anything more than the weather and Leo's upcoming end-of-year exams. Leo sat between his parents with the focused attention of a child who has learned that family dinners in this house sometimes turn into something else entirely. I set my fork down, opened the blue notebook to the page I had marked. "I have something to say," I said. "I'd like everyone to hear it at once." Michael's jaw tightened. Sarah's hand went still on her wine glass. "Over the past 3 weeks," I said, "I've made note of 8 occasions on which Sarah left this house on Tuesday afternoons and visited the residence of Marcus Webb at number 44 on the Upper Road. The first occasion was in late October. The most recent was this past Tuesday." I looked at Ray. "You've seen the notebook?" "I have," Ray said. "The entries are dated and specific." The room did not move. Leo looked at his plate. Sarah's wine glass was still in her hand, tilted very slightly, and she was watching it as though the angle of the liquid inside it required her full attention. Michael turned to look at his wife. The expression on his face was not what I expected. I had anticipated anger, the explosive, table-clearing anger I had seen from him twice in the past 8 months. What came instead was something quieter and more permanent. The look of a man watching a version of his life he had believed in dissolve in real time, and understanding that it had been dissolving for longer than he had known. Sarah. His voice came out stripped of everything except the name itself. She set the glass down, squared her shoulders. When she looked at Michael, her eyes were dry and direct, and in that directness was the particular courage of a person who has been caught and has decided that the only remaining option is to stop pretending. "It's not what you think," she said. And then after a pause that lasted long enough to make it clear she knew how that sounded, "It's exactly what you think." Michael pushed back from the table. His chair scraped the floor. He stood with both hands flat on the table and breathed through his nose for a long moment, and I watched my son absorb a betrayal on top of every other loss the past 8 months had delivered, and I felt something I had not expected to feel. Not satisfaction, not vindication, grief. Clean and simple for the family this could have been and was not. "I kept this information," I said quietly, "because of Leo, not to use against either of you. But if custody becomes a matter before a court, I will provide this documentation to protect my access to my grandson. That is the only reason it exists." Leo looked up from his plate then, looked at me. His face was the face of a boy who has just been told in the most indirect possible way that an adult in his life is thinking about his future even when everything else is falling apart. He looked back down. Michael straightened, looked at Sarah with the hollow, burned-out quality of a man who has run out of places to put his anger and is simply standing in the ash of it. "Get out," he said to her. His voice was very low. Tonight, Sarah stood up without a word. She took her wine glass to the kitchen, rinsed it, set it in the rack. The ordinary gesture of someone maintaining form when everything else has lost it. Then she walked upstairs, and we heard her moving in the room above us, quiet, methodical, the sounds of a woman who had known this moment was coming and had already in some part of herself begun to pack. Ray picked up his water glass and drank from it, set it down, looked at me. I shook my head slightly. "Not now." Leo reached across the table and took the last dinner roll from the basket. He tore it in half, buttered one piece, handed the other to me without looking up. I took it. We sat there, the three of us, in the particular silence of people who have just watched something end and do not yet know what comes next. And outside the window, the Bel Air hills went dark in the long June evening, and somewhere up on the ridge, the mockingbird was still at it, borrowing everyone else's song. Leo got sick on a Tuesday in July. I know it was a Tuesday because I had just come in from my walk, the one that took me past Stone Canyon, and the reservoir, and the upper road, where number 44 now had its curtains drawn every afternoon when I heard the sound from upstairs. Not a cry. Something quieter than that. The kind of sound a child makes when he has decided he is too old to cry, but his body has not yet agreed. I went up. He was in his bed, with the covers pulled to his chin, despite the heat. His face flushed the particular deep red of a fever that has been running for longer than it should before anyone noticed. The thermometer on his nightstand read 103.1. A glass of water sat on the table beside it, empty. Michael was not in the house. He had stopped coming home before 9 most evenings, the pattern of a man who finds the place he lives in harder to enter than to leave. I sat on the edge of Leo's bed and put my hand on his forehead, the way Carol used to put her hand on mine when I was sick. Flat and cool and unhurried, the specific comfort of a hand that is not checking a temperature, but simply saying, "I am here." Leo opened his eyes. "Hey, Grandpa," he said. His voice came out thin and rough. "Hey," I said. "How long have you felt this way?" "Since this morning." He swallowed. I didn't want to bother anyone. I looked at him for a moment. 11 years old, and already fluent in the language of not bothering anyone, a language I recognized, because I had spent 30 years surrounded by people who spoke it, and a marriage to a woman who had spent 30 years teaching me that it was not a virtue. "You're not a bother," I said. "You're my grandson." I went downstairs and got the things I needed. A bowl of cool water, a clean cloth, 2 acetaminophen from the medicine cabinet, a glass of water, and the carton of chicken broth I kept in the pantry for occasions that required something simple and reliable. I put the broth on the gas burner, the portable one still on the counter, still more dependable than the electric range, and went back upstairs. We spent the evening that way. I brought him the broth in a mug when it was warm, helped him with the medication, changed the cloth on his forehead when it lost its cool. He drifted in and out of sleep, and in the intervals when he was awake, we talked or did not talk, both of which were fine. Around 10, he opened his eyes and looked at the ceiling. "Are Mom and Dad getting divorced?" he asked. "I don't know," I said. "That's their decision to make. Dad doesn't come home anymore." "I know. And Mom's at Aunt Christine's." A pause. "She called today. She cried on the phone." He turned his head to look at me. "I told her it was okay, but it's not really okay." "No," I said. "It's not, but it will get to okay eventually. Things usually do." He was quiet for a while. The portable work lamp on the nightstand threw a warm circle of light over the bed, and outside the window, the July heat had settled into the hills with the particular weight of a California summer that has decided to stay. "Grandpa," Leo said, "are you going to leave too?" The question landed in my chest with the specific gravity of the things children ask when they have stopped worrying about whether the answer will be comfortable. "Not tonight," I said. He looked at me. "That's what you said in October. When I asked if you were going to leave, you said not tonight." I had forgotten he remembered that. Children remember everything, which is one of the things adults consistently underestimate about them. "I remember," I said. "So when are you going to leave?" I looked at him for a long moment. At the cowlick. At the fever still sitting in his cheeks. At the 11-year-old face that had been doing the work of understanding this family for longer than anyone had asked him to. I have some things to take care of first, I said. And when I go, you'll know before it happens. I promise you that. He studied me with the focused intensity of a child, deciding whether to believe something. Okay, he said finally. And then quieter. I'm sorry I used to call you old man. The thing that moved through my chest then was not sadness exactly. It was something that arrives when a person you love says the thing you needed to hear at a time when you did not know you needed it. You didn't know better, I said. Now you do. He slept after that. I stayed in the chair beside the bed until past midnight, changing the cloth, checking the thermometer, listening to the particular breathing of a child whose fever has broken and who is sleeping the deep, unguarded sleep of someone who has said what needed saying and can now rest. At 1:15, I went downstairs and found Michael at the kitchen counter, still in his work clothes, staring at nothing in particular, with the expression of a man who has run out of surfaces to project his problems onto. He looked up when I came in. He did not ask about Leo. He did not ask how long the fever had been running or whether I had checked it or what I had given him. He looked at me for a moment with the hollow eyes of someone who has been emptied out by the day and has nothing left for questions. I filled a glass of water, set it on the counter in front of him, and went back upstairs. The next Saturday, Ray knocked on the front door at 9 in the morning with Leo already standing beside him in his sneakers and a backpack. Michael answered, looked at Ray, looked at his son. Ray said, I'm taking the boy to spend the day with his grandfather. You have a problem with that. Take it up with your lawyer. Michael looked at Leo. Leo looked back at his father with the clear, steady gaze of a child who has made a decision and is comfortable with it. Michael stepped aside. Ray and Leo came in. Leo dropped his backpack at the foot of the stairs, came to the kitchen where I was making eggs on the gas burner, and sat on the stool at the counter. I brought the chess set, he said. Good, I said. Eggs first. Okay, he said. And then after a pause, Grandpa, I think you're going to win. I looked at him. The chess, I said. He shook his head just slightly and reached for his fork. The 1st of August came and went without a check. I had expected this. Not hoped for it, expected it the way you expect a storm when you have been watching the pressure drop for 3 weeks. Michael's account, which I knew from the utility billing statements Ray had been processing, had been running on fumes since June. The institutional withdrawals had taken the firm's revenue below its operating costs. He was paying staff before himself, which I recognized as the last honorable instinct of a man watching something he built or believed he built come apart. On the 4th of August, I slid the notice under his bedroom door. 3 days. Pay the outstanding balance of $3,500 or vacate the premises. It was a single page, the language required by California Civil Code, formal and impersonal, in the way that legal documents are formal and impersonal because they are not written for the people involved, but for the process that comes after them. I heard him pick it up from the other side of the door. The small sound of paper lifting from hardwood. A long pause. Then footsteps moving away from the door toward the window, the pacing pattern of a man reading something he does not want to be true. He did not pay. On the 8th, I filed the unlawful detainer with the LA Superior Court on Spring Street. Ray came with me not because I needed company, but because he knew the clerk at the filing window from his years of practice, and the paperwork moved through in 40 minutes instead of the usual afternoon. The case number went into the blue notebook beside the date. The court date was set for the 22nd. I did not attend in person. Ray represented the filing as my authorized agent, which he was licensed to do, and the judgment came back the same afternoon. Possession of the property to be returned to the owner. The occupant to vacate within 5 days of service. Michael was served on the 23rd. I gave him the 5 days. Not because the law required me to wait, The sheriff could have enforced the order sooner, but because 5 days felt like the minimum a father owes a son even at the end of something like this. On the morning of the 28th, I called a locksmith. He arrived at 8, a young man with a work van and a methodical efficiency that reminded me of the flatbed operator who had come for the cars in April. He changed every lock in the house in 90 minutes, front door, side gate, garage, the back door that opened onto the garden, replacing the old hardware with a new keyed system. 3 keys cut, all of them mine. When he was done, I paid him, thanked him, and went upstairs. I had packed Michael's things the previous evening. 2 suitcases, the large ones from the hall closet, the ones we had bought for a family trip to Maine the summer Leo was 4. I had folded his clothes carefully the way Carol had taught me to fold things. Shirts, face-down sleeves, in nothing creased that didn't need to be. I had included his laptop, his charging cables, the framed photograph from his desk of Leo at age 3, standing in a tide pool in Malibu, squinting into the sun. I carried the suitcases downstairs and set them on the front step, the way you set things down when you want the other person to be able to pick them up without asking for help. Then I waited. His rideshare pulled up at 5:17. I heard the car door, the particular sound of a man getting out of a vehicle already thinking about something else. Then footsteps on the front path. Then the sound of a key in the lock that no longer matched. A pause. The key again. Harder this time. Then quiet. I looked over the balcony railing. Michael stood at the front door with his hand still on the key, his head slightly bowed, his shoulders carrying the particular weight of a man who has arrived at the moment he knew was coming, and finds when it arrives that knowing does not prepare you for it. He looked up. We looked at each other across the 20 feet of California evening air, and I felt the grief I had been carrying since October move through me one more time, heavier now. The way grief gets heavier, the closer it gets to being finished. The locks have been changed, I said. The court order was served 5 days ago. Your suitcases are by the door. He picked up the first one, then the second. He stood on the front path with a suitcase in each hand and looked up at me, and his face was not angry. That was the thing I had not expected. After 8 months of anger at the breakfast table, in the driveway, on the phone, at the front door with the police, there was no anger left in it. What was left was something older and quieter, and I recognized it because I had seen it in the mirror the morning after Carol died. It was the face of a man who understood finally what he had lost. "Dad," he said. Just the word. Nothing attached to it. "I know," I said. Ray was at the fence. He was not smiling. He had his arms crossed and his eyes on the ground, and the expression of a man who is present, because presence is what the moment requires, not because there is anything good about it. Michael picked up both suitcases, walked to the end of the path, called his rideshare. I stayed on the balcony until the car turned the corner and the street was quiet again. Then I went inside, sat at my desk, and opened the blue notebook. I held the pen over the page for a long time. Finally, I wrote one line. He left at 5:22. I loved him every minute of it. Daniel called on a Thursday afternoon while I was in the garden. I had been deadheading the roses along the south wall, a task I had taken on after Ray taught me the basics in the spring. The simple discipline of removing what was finished, so the plant could put its energy into what was still growing. I heard the phone in my shirt pocket and looked at the screen and set down the clippers before I answered. "It's done," Daniel said. I sat on the bench beside the olive tree. He walked me through it in the precise, unhurried way he had always delivered difficult information, the way I had taught him 20 years ago on the 34th floor, that bad news lands better when it is spoken slowly and completely, rather than softened into something unrecognizable. FINRA had completed its preliminary investigation. The violations were confirmed: improper use of customer funds, inadequate disclosure, failure to maintain required reserves. Michael's broker-dealer license had been suspended pending a formal disciplinary hearing. The firm's remaining institutional clients had been notified by the regulator. The board had voted that morning to remove Michael as chief executive effective immediately. So they moved fast, I said. The documentation was thorough, Daniel said. You kept good records, Arthur. I keep everything. A pause on the line. How are you? It was the question I had been avoiding since August, the one that had no clean answer. I looked at the olive tree, at the new growth that had come in silver green since spring, and was now the same dark color as the old branches, indistinguishable from what had always been there. I'm all right, I said. I didn't want this for him. I know. I want you to know that. It matters to me that you know it. I know, Arthur, Daniel said quietly. That's why you waited as long as you did. We stayed on the line for another moment without speaking, the comfortable silence of two people who have known each other long enough that silence does not require filling. Thank you, I said, for everything. Call me when you get to the island, he said. I put the phone in my pocket and did not move for a while. The afternoon was doing what California afternoons do in late August, the light going amber and heavy, the hills across the canyon holding their color longer than seemed reasonable. The air carrying the particular dry warmth of a season at its end. I had lived through 47 of these summers, and I still could not decide if they were beautiful or mournful, which perhaps meant they were both. I went inside and found the photograph. It was in the top drawer of my desk, where I kept the things I needed to have close, but did not want to look at everyday Carol's watch. Leo's first chess move written on a paper napkin from a Saturday in February, and this. A photograph from 1991. Michael, at 8 years old, standing beside me in the lobby of the building on Broad Street, where I worked, wearing the small blazer his mother had bought him for the occasion, and holding a visitor badge in both hands with the gravity of a boy who has been told he is somewhere important. He had been so proud that day, of the building of the badge, of being the son of the man who worked there. He had asked me on the elevator how the stock market worked, and I had tried to explain it in terms an 8-year-old could hold, and he had listened with the focused attention he used to bring to everything before the world taught him that attention was less useful than ambition. I did not know when that had changed. That was the truth I had been sitting with since October, the question underneath all the other questions. Not what Michael had become, but when and whether there had been a moment I had missed, a door I had left open or closed at the wrong time, a thing I had said or failed to say that had sent him in the direction he went. I put the photograph back in the drawer. Ray knocked at 6. He came in without being asked, which was his habit now, and found me at the kitchen counter and stood across from me without saying anything, because Ray was a man who understood that some conversations begin better in silence. FINRA came through, I said. I heard. He paused. Leo called me this afternoon, asked if his dad was going to be okay. I looked up. What did you tell him? I told him his dad was going to have a hard year and then probably a better one. Ray crossed his arms. I told him that's how it usually works. Is that true? Ray considered it. Often enough. I filled 2 glasses of water and set one in front of him. I'm going to sell the house, I said. Ray did not look surprised. He picked up his glass, drank, set it down. I figured. I want to list it next month. I'd like you to handle the paperwork. Of course. A pause. Where are you going? Catalina, I said. I found a place, small, quiet, looks out over the water. Ray looked at me for a long moment with the expression of a man examining something and finding it sound. Carol would have liked that, he said. The thing that moved through my chest was not grief this time. It was something lighter. The specific feeling of a decision that has been made correctly and that the body knows it before the mind catches up. She would have complained about the ferry, I said, and then she would have loved it. Ray smiled. A real one, the kind that reaches the eyes. Leo, he said. I'll tell him myself, I said. Before anything else, he came on a Sunday morning. No call ahead, no text. Just the sound of the doorbell at 7:45, which told me everything. Before I opened the door, only people who are desperate or certain show up unannounced before 8. Michael stood on the front step in clothes that had been slept in. He had lost weight since August. His face had the particular hollowness of someone who has been running on adrenaline and has finally run out of it. "Can I come in?" he said. I stepped back from the door. He sat at the kitchen table, his old chair, the one he had occupied for 8 months of breakfasts, and put both hands flat on the surface and looked at them. I made coffee, set a cup in front of him, sat across. "I need your help," he said. "I know. The firm is finished. The license is suspended. The board," he stopped, started again. "I have creditors, the clients whose funds another stop." He was having trouble saying it out loud, which I understood. There are things that are real before you say them, and more real after, and he was not ready for more real. "I know what you did with the funds, Michael." He looked up. Something moved across his face, the specific shame of a man realizing the person he most wanted not to know already knew. "If you could just talk to the bank," he said. "Your name, your reputation, one conversation. That's all I'm asking." I looked at my son, at the hollowed face, at the hands on the table, the same hands I had held crossing streets when he was 4 years old. "I can't do that," I said. "Dad, not because I don't love you." I kept my voice level. "Because it wouldn't help. You can't borrow your way out of what happened. You know that. You knew it when you made the trades." He pressed the heels of his hands into his eyes. His shoulders came forward, the posture of a man folding inward, and for a long moment the kitchen was quiet, except for the mockingbird outside doing its work in the olive tree. "I have something to tell you," I said. He lowered his hands. "I listed the house 6 weeks ago. We have a buyer. The sale closes at the end of this month." He stared at me. "I've decided to donate the proceeds to a children's foundation here in Los Angeles, a place that provides housing and education for kids who don't have what you had." I paused. "What I gave you," the stare continued. Behind it, I could see him processing not the charity, not the money, but the finality of it. The house he had believed was his future being handed to strangers, and the price of it going somewhere he could not reach. "You're giving it away," he said. "Yes. All of it. All of it." He stood up, walked to the window, stood with his back to me, looking out at the garden, at the olive tree, at the roses along the south wall that I had been deadheading since spring. "See why?" he said. Not angry, genuinely asking. "Because it was always mine to give," I said. "And I want it to do something I'm proud of." He turned around. His eyes were wet, which surprised me. I had not seen Michael cry since his mother's funeral. "What am I supposed to do?" he said. "Start over," I said. "Smaller. Honestly." I looked at him. "You're 42 years old, and you're still healthy, and you're still smart. Those are not small things. You're not going to help me. I'm helping you right now," I said. "You just don't recognize it yet." He picked up his coffee cup, drank, set it back down with the careful deliberateness of a man trying to hold himself together through ordinary actions. "Leo," he said. I want to be better for Leo." "Then be better for Leo," I said. "That's not something I can give you. That's something you do." He nodded. Once, slowly. The nod of a man accepting a verdict he cannot appeal. He walked to the door, stopped with his hand on the frame. "Dad." He did not turn around. "I'm sorry." The words landed the way the real ones always do, without announcement, without performance, simply there, solid and late and true. "I know you are," I said. "So am I." He left. I stood at the window and watched him walk down the front path and out the gate and down the hill, smaller and smaller in the morning light, until he turned the corner and was gone. Ray appeared at the fence 10 minutes later with 2 cups of coffee. He handed one over the top without a word. We stood there in the Sunday morning quiet, and the mockingbird sang, and the olive tree held its ground the way it always had. And I thought about the difference between letting go and giving up, and how the distance between them is exactly as wide as you decide it is. The house sold on a Thursday. I was not there when the papers were signed. Ray handled the closing as my authorized agent, which freed me to spend the morning doing what I wanted to do with the last day in the house. I made coffee on the gas burner, which I had never replaced with anything better, because it had served me well, and I saw no reason to fix what was not broken. I sat on the bench beside the olive tree. I watched the scrub jays work the feeder. I listened to the mockingbird run through its catalog one more time. Then I went inside and packed the last box. It was not a large box. 31 years of accumulation had been reduced over the past 3 weeks to what fit in a modest 2-bedroom on Catalina Island, books Carol's watch. The chest set the photograph from 1991, the recipe cards in her handwriting that I had kept in the kitchen drawer since she died. The blue notebook I put in my shirt pocket where it had lived since October. I left one thing behind deliberately. The bench in the garden, the one beside the olive tree. I had built it the spring I bought the house from reclaimed wood a neighbor was throwing out, and it had outlasted 2 coats of paint and 1 bad winter and 8 months of a family falling apart around it. It belonged to the garden. The garden belonged to whoever came next. Ray arrived at noon with Leo. The boy came through the side gate at a run, which was how Leo moved when he had decided something was important, and stopped in front of me with his backpack on, and his face doing the complicated work of a child trying to be brave about something he was not entirely ready for. "You packed everything," he said. "Almost everything." He looked around the garden, at the feeder, at the roses, at the bench. "You left the bench," he said. "It belongs here." He nodded, accepting this with the seriousness he brought to things that mattered. Then he reached onto his backpack and produced the chess set, the weighted pieces in the roll-up board I had given him in February, and held it out to me. "For the island," he said. "So you have someone to play against, even when I'm not there." I took it. The weight of it was familiar in my hands, the small, solid mass of something that had been used and would be used again. "Thank you," I said. He threw his arms around my waist and pressed his face against my shoulder, and held on with the particular force of a child who has decided that the length of a hug can substitute for the words he does not have. I put one hand on the back of his head, the cowlick, and held on in return. After a while, he pulled back. His eyes were bright, but his jaw was set. "You promised you'd tell me before you left," he said. "I'm telling you now." "You promised I'd have time. You have right now," I said. "That's not nothing." He thought about that. decided with the pragmatism of an 11-year-old who has had a difficult year that it would have to be enough. I reached into my jacket pocket and took out the envelope. "This is for you," I said. "Don't open it now. Give it to Ray to hold until you're ready." I looked at him. "It's a trust. It has your name on it. It will be there when you're 25, no matter what happens between now and then. It's not from me to your father. It's from me to you." He took it with both hands. "What's in it?" he said. "Enough," I said. "To start something honest." He held the envelope against his chest and looked at me with the clear, steady gaze that had been developing in him since October, since the stairs, and the police, and the fever, and the chess games, and all the Saturday mornings in between. "Grandpa," he said, "are you happy?" The question surprised me. Not because it was unexpected from Leo. Leo asked the questions other people circled around, but because of how easy the answer was. "I'm getting there," I said, "which is the best any of us can do." Ray put his hand on my shoulder briefly, the hand of a man saying everything he needed to say without the inconvenience of words. I put my hand over his for a moment. Then I picked up my bag. We walked out through the side gate together, the three of us, and Ray locked it behind us with the key I had given him. He would handle the final walkthrough for the new family who were moving in on Saturday with a stroller and a golden retriever and whatever hopes people carry into a house that has held other people's lives. At the harbor, Ray loaded my bags into his car and drove us to the San Pedro terminal where the Catalina Express sat at the dock in the September morning light, white and ordinary, and going exactly where I needed to go. Leo stood beside me at the gate while Ray dealt with the luggage. "Call me Sundays," Leo said. "Every Sunday," I said. 4 o'clock. "And you'll come back for Christmas?" "I'll come back for Christmas." He nodded, satisfied. The terms of an arrangement negotiated and agreed. I handed my ticket to the gate's attendant and walked down the gangway and found a seat at the stern where I could watch the harbor recede as the boat pulled out. Leo and Ray were at the railing above the dock, Leo waving with his whole arm the way children wave when they want to make sure you see them. I raised my hand. The boat moved out into the channel, and the city began to shrink behind us. And ahead, the water was blue and open, and the island was a green shape on the horizon getting larger. I reached into my shirt pocket and took out the blue notebook, opened it to the last page, wrote the date, wrote the time, wrote 4 words: "The water is good." Then I closed it, put it back in my pocket, and watched California get smaller until it was just light on the water, and then just water, and then the island filling up everything in front of me, patient and green and entirely mine. I have spent 68 years learning one thing that Wall Street never taught me, and that no balance sheet has ever captured. Character is the only asset that compounds without limit, and the only one that once spent takes a lifetime to rebuild. God has a way of making sure every man eventually sits across from the consequences of his own choices. Michael sat across from his. I sat across from mine. The difference was only in how long we had each been avoiding that table. If you are a father watching your family drift in a direction that troubles you, speak. Earlier than feels comfortable, louder than feels dignified. I waited and called it patience. It was not patience. It was the most expensive silence of my life. Do not make that same trade. And if you have ever looked at someone who loved you and decided their sacrifice was simply the landscape you were owed, look again. Before the locksmith comes. Before the ferry leaves the harbor. These are the family justice stories that don't make the evening news. The dad's revenge stories that feel nothing like revenge from the inside. They feel like grief and paperwork, and a bench left behind in a garden for strangers. True family justice was never about what I took back. It was about what I refused to surrender. The dad's revenge stories worth telling are the ones where the father walks away whole. That is the only family justice I was ever after. If something in this story landed for you, leave a comment. Tell me which part hit closest. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want to be here when the next story comes, you already know what to do. Thank you for staying until the very end. Truly. The stories ahead contain fictional elements crafted to reflect truths about family loyalty and the cost of taking love for granted. If that is not for you today, no judgment. But if you are staying, I am glad to have you here.